Hey everyone, I'm John Michael. I'm an intern here at Pangea and a counseling student at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. And for the past several weeks, we've been in a sermon series called Things Jesus Never Said. Basically, we've been talking about these different kind of Christian catchphrases that are thrown around that, when looked at more closely, don't really have a lot of backing in what Jesus taught. So as I was thinking about what saying I wanted to talk about, I was just thinking about how I always, as a counseling student and as someone who is a follower of Jesus, I always want to kind of integrate both of those aspects of my life and see kind of what they can say about each other and what they can what they can teach me as I kind of hold them both. And in that, one particular saying really stuck out to me as something that just doesn't really seem to stack up to what I understand about psychologically how God has made us, and nor does it stack up with what Jesus teaches. And that saying is, God doesn't want you to be happy, God wants you to be holy. So when you look at that, I think, like right off the bat, the thing that really just strikes me about that is that it creates this kind of false dichotomy between our faith and our feelings. So it kind of pushes the message that in order to be faithful, we have to disregard our feelings and what we're feeling. Several months back, I read this article in a popular Christian magazine, and this pastor was giving this example. He had just played a golf tournament earlier that day and had not done very well, was really disappointed with his performance. And he was frustrated. He was trying to hold it in, trying to not do anything that he shouldn't do. So he gets in the car with his wife and kids, and his little 5-year-old daughter just innocently asks him, oh, Daddy, how did your golf tournament go? And in that moment, he just kind of lost it, and he was pounding on the dashboard and just like freaking out. And this is how he described it in the article. And he talked about how after he calmed down, he was really embarrassed, and felt like he really shouldn't have done that. It wasn't the appropriate response. But the thing that I really kind of disagreed with in this article was that his conclusion wasn't how do I understand why I'm angry like this and why I had such a strong reaction, but he was just kind of I shouldn't have felt this way, my feelings were wrong, I just should have followed Jesus over this. And what really struck me about this is that, as one of our values here at Pangea says, the value of transformation, following Jesus makes us more human. And part of being human is having emotions. There's something that God gave us as a part of how we operate. And, if he had paid attention to his emotions in that moment, they're indicating something. There's a truth behind why he reacted that way that just disregarding them doesn't touch on. And it trivializes the human experience. Like I said, they're a part of who we are. And when we say that we need to just disregard them, have faith over our feelings, it makes us feel like a part of how we approach the world, a part of how we relate is wrong and it's broken. And I'm not saying that all emotions are perfect, but the act of having emotions isn't the issue. And it makes us feel like the things we feel separate us from God. Like, oh, when I get angry, this is separating me from being faithful. And really what ends up happening is it's just a really dehumanizing way of living, you know. We have to kind of fall in line, behave, or else. And the pursuit of holiness feels more like a threat, or a threat than the encouragement that it's supposed to be. And what I feel it comes down to is really the way we look at holiness. So I think that in kind of understanding, you know, maybe a way that our faith and our feelings don't have to be at war with each other, we have to relook at what holiness is. So I want to start with a passage that's going to be up on the screen for you, Romans 12, 1 and 2. And it says, "So brothers and sisters, because of God's mercies, I encourage you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice that is holy and pleasing to God. This is your appropriate priestly service. Don't be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you can figure out what God's will is, what is good and pleasing and mature." So just looking at this passage, a few things stand out to me as far as what it means to be holy. First, we're asked to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. And part of that, as it says, is not being conformed to the patterns of this world, but instead being transformed by the renewing of our minds. So that raises the questions, first, what are patterns of this world? And also, how do we renew our minds? And then it says what the end result is if we do renew our minds, and that's figuring out what God's will is, what is good and pleasing and mature. So our goal in holiness is aligning ourselves with God's will. So I found a great quote from N.T. Wright that breaks down this passage a little bit, and I think it brings up some really important points. And he says, "For Paul, the mind and the body are closely interconnected and must work as a coherent team. Having one's mind renewed and offering God's one body are all part of the same complete event. Here Paul uses a vivid, indeed shocking idea. One's whole self, that's what Paul means by body, must be laid on the altar like a sacrifice in the temple. The big difference is that, whereas the sacrifice is there to be killed, the Christian's self-offering is actually about coming alive with a new life that bursts out in unexpected ways once the evil deeds of the self are put to death." So if we look back at this passage, evil deeds of the self are things that separate us from doing God's will. And I know, at least for me, initially hearing that phrase, the evil deeds of the self, is kind of jarring. I kind of cringe a little bit when I hear it because it sounds pretty harsh. But I really think that if we understand what holiness means, putting to death the evil deeds of the flesh or the self is actually a really great thing and something that is life-giving. Once we look at what it means to follow God's will. And if we look at 1 John 4:7, it says, "Dear friends, let's love one another, because love is from God, and everyone who loves is born from God and knows God." So if we look at this, and actually if you look at verse 8 right after that, it says, "Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love." So this verse shows, that love is an integral part of who God is, a part of God's identity. And it's also something we are called to be a part of. And furthermore, there's a relational aspect to it, that whoever loves knows God and is known by God. So if following God's will means to love and to connect with others and to connect with God, ultimately the purpose of holiness is relationship. It's not about following these specific set of rules for the sake of not falling out of line. It's not about, checking off all the boxes so that we're, quote, good Christians. But it's about positioning ourselves in a way that we are able to both connect with others on a deeper level and connect with God on a deeper level. As a counseling student, I had to, bring some of that into my example. So I want to talk about a concept known as limbic resonance. So our limbic system is the emotional core of our brains. It has a lot to do with memory and a lot to do with our base emotional reactions. And part of what this system is able to do is through, looking at a person's body language, their tone of voice, and also actually we emit electromagnetic signals about what our emotions are feeling. And through this, we're actually able to connect with what other people are feeling. We're able to share this unspoken emotional connection with one another. And through this, it creates an emotional, psychological, and physiological experience of empathy with one another, with caring for one another. But this can get disrupted. I'm actually gonna go to a video up on the screen that explains neuroplasticity. Could you pause it for just a sec? Sorry.
Not so long ago, many scientists believe that the brain...
And this video is basically showing that our brains change throughout our lives. So we're going to go ahead and watch that, and I'll explain more.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, that it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true. The brain can and does change throughout our lives. It is adaptable, like plastic. Hence, neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. How does neuroplasticity work? If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, there are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well-travelled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say we think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. We start carving out a new road. If we keep travelling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and weakens. This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action. The good news is that we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. If you have ever changed a bad habit or thought about something differently, you have carved a new pathway in your brain and experienced neuroplasticity firsthand. With repeated and directed attention towards your desired change, you can rewire your brain.
Yeah, so the fact that our brains can change are meldable. The relationships that we experience, the different traumas or just any struggles that we experience over and over shape our views of ourselves and our views of God. And so this means that people are prone to different relational kind of temptations, or people are prone to react to relationships in different ways that often draws away from connecting with God and with each other versus connecting with one another and with God. But as the video showed, neuroplasticity, exists throughout our lives. So, if we currently have issues with connecting with others, as I talked about limbic resonance, we're not putting ourselves or able to put ourselves in a posture of connecting with others, with empathizing with each other. We can actually retrain our brains to do these things differently. And going back to the verse, that's really like probably not what Paul had in mind at this time, because I don't even think they had the same concept of the brain being where thought comes from back in those days. But it connects to that same idea that as we are connecting with God's will, loving God, loving one another's, we're renewing our minds. We're creating new patterns against the patterns of this world, the patterns of disconnection, the patterns of selfishness, or kind of like self-centeredness, and connecting with this caring, this ability to care and love one another. And so I want to go to another quote. This is by Dr. Kurt Thompson. He is a psychiatrist, medical doctor, but he's also a Christian. He has a Christian faith. So like I've been trying to do, and he's been doing this much longer than I have, but he is always looking for the connections between his Christian faith and what he knows as a psychiatrist and what he learns through the medical field and through these neurobiological things. And what he says is everything is connected. The question is whether or not we will pay attention to it. As such, we cannot separate what we do with our brains and our relationships from what we do with God. Likewise, as we pay close attention to what stories in Scripture tell us about the people of God, about their experiences with Him and with each other, our very neural networks and minds are renewed. In essence, God is inviting us into a deeper, more joyful, more secure in relationship with Him and each other. So what this means is, as I've been saying, it's kind of like an endless feedback loop in the best way, in that following God teaches us how to love each other better, how to pursue these relationships, how to experience this deeper, more joyful, more secure relationship. And then as we retrain our brains, we're able to do this better. So it's just a constant cycle of improving one off of the other. And this is one kind of big piece of what holiness is. And I'm not saying that that holiness is just a neurobiological phenomena, but that's just one area of our lives when we dig into what it means to follow God's will, that we are pursuing holiness. And the cool thing to me about this is it really opens us up to so many different ways that we can pursue holiness and pursue a closer relationship with God. This might be a little bit biased for me to say, but holiness can look like going to counseling, to going to therapy, to talking to someone about your relationships and what you have going on. It can look like having a difficult conversation with a close friend, or having a fun conversation with a close friend. It can look like, for some people, exercising and getting more in touch with that. So it's really just like a variety of things. And holiness, it's not about, like I keep saying, it's not about this specific set of rules. There's not one formula for what exactly it looks like for each individual to be holy. But if we look at what our day-to-day lives are like, what are things in our day-to-day lives that draw us closer to God and each other, and what are things that draw us further away from God and each other, just paying attention to those patterns and what it is and what they are, we can start imagining what it looks like to change some of those things and pursue a deeper relationship with God and each other. So in closing, I think I have the quotes a little bit different here, but holiness isn't found through a set of rules, but through transformative relationships with God and each other. So I really just think that's what it comes down to, is that we're just positioning ourselves to connect, and that's what holiness means.